Last year, Christians made over $6 trillion in America. To put that into perspective, just 10% of that would have paid for World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. I'm Andrew Esparza. I'm the founder of Kingdom Analytics, and welcome to our series, Church Trends. In this episode, we're going to be talking about giving in the church. So to tithe or not to tithe? That's the question. For most Americans, the answer is resoundingly not to tithe. If you were to poll churchgoers, about 17% of them would say they're tithing, giving 10% or more of their income to the local church. The reality is that's a lot closer to 3%. So understanding the realities of your community is important to this, because it gives you some expectations when it comes to giving. For example, cost of living plays a big role in this. Let's look at a few scenarios where this may come into play. For example, I'm going to put Honolulu up on the screen here. When we look at Honolulu, the average income in this particular study area in Honolulu is about $79,000. The average income in America today is closer to $59,000-$60,000. So you would think, okay, Honolulu, churches in this area, people have higher incomes, they're probably giving more. Well, you have to look a little deeper here. The reality is it's 76% more expensive to live in Honolulu than average America. Now, we saw the income's higher, but it's only 32% higher than the average American income. So what that translates to is actually a cost of living deficit of over $26,000 a year. So we have to kind of take that into account with, okay, hey, people in these areas, they have higher income, but they have higher expenses too, and that may play a part in some of their giving. To show another example, I'll pull up Richmond, Virginia. This particular study area, Richmond, Virginia, is actually about 5% less expensive than average America. That said, incomes are 17% higher. So what you run into here is actually a cost of living surplus of about $13,000. So there's a little extra margin. So that kind of shows why understanding your community and some of the cost of living constraints or surpluses in your community is important to understanding some things about giving. So at Kingdom Analytics, we've worked with over 200 churches all across the country. And whenever we work with churches, we're looking at demographics, geographics, psychographics, all these things and trends. And what we found is there's a couple key patterns we tend to see with almost all the churches we work with, and a few of those patterns are, I'll pull up another slide here, has to do with income. So when we're looking at income, and this is something we do with a lot of the churches we work with, is we'll take an address list and we'll analyze everybody in that congregation. We'll analyze everybody in the community, maybe a 20-minute drive around that congregation, and we get a lot of income data back. And when we look at the community, one of the interesting things we've been seeing in about probably 90% of the churches we work with is the income of people in the church tends to be about 10%, even a little higher, and that's a trend and a pattern we've been seeing. You could say, well, that's people who are able to not have to work on weekends and maybe they have higher income, or you could say what I like to lean to is these are people following God's will for their lives and living out biblically and having biblical finance backgrounds and things like that. And because of that, they have some higher income. So that's a pattern we've been seeing. It's not the case for every church we work with, but again, about 90% or so, we kind of constantly see a higher income for the congregation versus the community that they're in, and that presents some unique opportunities for the church when it comes to serving our community. Another pattern we see is churches we work with is the amount given in tithes, or we'll just say gifts, if you will, because it's rarely ever 10%. So I'll put up the example here. Let's say we look at a particular church congregation And through our analysis, we find the total income of the congregation is $10 million, okay? So it's $10 million, maybe that's split between 200 households. Everybody's making, we'll say, 50,000. What we found in all the churches we've worked with is the average gift, or the average tithe, if you will, tends to be about 2.5% of the congregation's total income. So in this example where we're looking at a total income of $10 million, if that was the case for this particular church, you could pretty accurately estimate that their operating budget based off of gifts, or their giving, would be about $250,000. Now, that said, that 2.5% tends to come from, or 80% of that tends to come from 20% of the congregation. So using some of the tools we have available, you can see we can dive into things from income all the way down to coffee preferences for your church. And really, the truth is that most Americans see giving as a luxury. They'll say, hey, this is something that'll be nice to do once I have enough money. But we know from Ecclesiastes 5:10, those who love money will never have enough. 75% of Americans report not being financially secure. So this is an area where the church needs to play a bigger role in educating and demonstrating biblical finance within the congregation. And there's some opportunities there for the church in helping to engage the community who's concerned about these things, but also then serving our congregation well too. So to kind of close out this section, I just want you to think about what would happen if every Christian in America tithed. And to give some perspective to that, if you took just the Christians in America and made them their own country, they would have the third largest GDP in the world. And that's a lot of resources. And we've been blessed with a lot of resources as Americans. And really having to ask the question of, are we stewarding those well? If we're only giving 2.5% of what we've been given and what is God's, are we really stewarding that well? Just kind of think about and imagine, what would the world look like if we, as a church, tithed, we were out of debt, all of these things, and how much could be done. I mean, you saw earlier when we started off, the income, just tithing off the income, would have paid for 2 world wars, Vietnam War. I mean, these are expensive things, and just think what kind of good that money could do in the world, and in just 1 year. If everybody tithed for just 1 year, just think about that. So there's really there's a lot of steps churches can take to really engage their congregation and reach those more, and that's what we're going to be talking about in part 2 of our series on giving here. We're going to dive into the psychographics of, okay, who are these people? How can we reach them? How can we best communicate what we're doing as a church to these people, to engage them in understanding how they're perceiving some of these things, how they go about giving, beliefs, values, what are their preferred outreaches. We'll dive into all that. There's a lot of great applications for your church there that you could take home with, and that's something we can always come in and help look at as well too. So I'm excited to talk with you guys in part 2, and we look forward to seeing you there. And I mean, just want to leave you with that. At the end of the day, we all know God doesn't need our money, but what he does want is for what it does in the hearts of his children when we give, and we give sacrificially. So thanks for going through part 1, and we look forward to seeing you in part 2.